The letter trembled in my hands as I read the mind-boggling figure typed in bold. At the end of the page, $300,000, the Homeowners Association was demanding that I pay them $300,000 in arrears and accrued fines for my supposed non-compliance with their rules. I had to read it 3 times before the reality dawned on me. They were threatening lawsuits, property liens, and even foreclosure. If I did not comply within 30 days, the official letterhead bore the pretentious gold-embossed logo of Oakage Estates Community Association, with the silhouette of oak trees that bore no resemblance to the actual century-old oaks on my property. I sat the letter on my grandfather's old oak desk, the same desk where he'd taught me how to balance the farm books when I was a 12-year-old, and breathed deeply to compose myself. The temerity was on the verge of being impressive. I'd never agreed to becoming a member of their association. Never signed any documents, had never even been thought of about being part of their community. Here they were claiming authority over property that had been in my family, since prior to their planning was even a drawing. My grandfather's farmhouse now seemed cold on a warm spring afternoon. The sturdy walls that had sheltered 5 generations of my family seemed to close in on me as I condemned this assault on our heritage. I went over to the kitchen window, still holding the letter, and gazed out over the green fields on which generations of my own family had tilled crops and raised animals. The golden wheat waves in the wind, a sharp contrast to the rows of cookie-cutter houses that had appeared on the eastern edge of my property. In the past few years, my grandfather had long regarded those creeping developments with a mixture of resignation and contempt. Progress marches on, he'd say, with a sigh. But it doesn't have to march over us. That's when I noticed something that chilled my blood just beyond the oak trees that had marked what I'd always believed was the property line. There was construction gear parked next to a half-finished swimming pool and tennis court complex. A sign boldly announced it as Oakage Estates Community Recreation Center. Opening this summer with a growing sense of unease, I pulled out my grandfather's old property maps from the desk drawer based on his exact measurements and the deed I'd inherited. Those oak trees weren't even the boundary at all. The actual property line ran nearly 300 yards beyond them. The Homeowners Association hadn't simply sent me a ridiculous bill. They had built their high-end new amenities on my land. The farm had been in my family for over 100 years. My great-grandfather had purchased these 500 acres when this entire county was only farmland. As far as the eye could see, I grew up here summers helping my grandfather keep the fields up and care for the animals when he passed away last year. At the age of 92, I got everything: the farmhouse, the barn, the equipment, and all the surrounding acreage. It was a mixed inheritance. I never had any intention of being a farmer, having made a life in the city as an architectural engineer. But I couldn't bear the thought of selling the property either, so I had compromised on moving into the farmhouse and leasing most of the farmland to the farmers next door. While I made up my mind on a long-term plan, in the 15 years that I had been away in college, the suburbs had closed in steadily on our previously rural property. What started as a scattering of individual housing developments had consolidated into a big planned suburb known as Oakage Estates. The houses started at $500,000 with manicured lawns and strict rules about everything, from mailbox designs to the acceptable shade of white for exterior trim. Their Homeowners Association was notorious throughout the county for its aggressive enforcement and hefty fines. Still, they had always kept their distance from our farm. Until now, apparently the next morning, I received another letter from the Homeowners Association. This one informed me that my agricultural activities were in violation of community standards, and that I had 30 days to remove all farm equipment from view. I laughed out loud at the absurdity of it. My family had been farming this land for decades before their precious development even existed. How could they possibly think they had jurisdiction over my property? But as the days passed, more notices arrived, each more threatening than the last. They quoted obscure county ordinances, made vague references to community welfare, and kept adding fines to my already astronomical bill. It was obvious. They were trying to intimidate me into submission, or perhaps blackmail me into selling my land at a discount, so they could implement their development. After 2 weeks of this aggravation, I decided it was time to investigate exactly what was going on. I drove to the county records office and requested all the land records relating to my farm and the Oakage Estates development. The clerk, an older, a woman called Margaret, who had met my grandfather, threw a sympathetic glance when I spelled out what I was doing. "Those Oakage people have been giving everyone in the neighborhood a headache," she whispered, while showing me a research table. "Your grandfather would never have put up with their foolishness." She returned 20 minutes later, rolling on a dolly boxes full of documents and a gigantic pile of maps and deeds close to 2 feet tall. "These are from the original land grants. I was informed she brought all that may possibly help take all time you need." The records office remained, except for an occasional whisper and muted whir of the climate control system. Upholding the old documents, I spent the entire day studying yellowed pages and blueprint originals, tracing boundary lines and cross-checking dates of ownership. I found my great-grandfather's original grant from 1894, with handwritten delineations of the property lines referring to landmarks no longer standing from the lightning. Hit Oak to the Bend in Crawford Creek. Later surveys had translated these to modern measurements and coordinates, but the property lines had not changed at all in more than a century. As I compared these ancient records with the development plans for Oakage Estates, discrepancies started to emerge. The developers' surveys 15 years ago had used their measurements from a different point than the old markers had indicated. The error wasn't extensive, about 40 feet at the southern edge, but it had grown as the property line extended north, creating a wedge of disputed land that encompassed quite a large piece of land. What I discovered left me amazed. Not only did the Homeowners Association build their new recreation center on my property, but the original developer had approximated the boundaries in error when constructing the development 15 years prior to the final 3 rows of homes. Perhaps 45 homes were situated in part on what was technically my land, based on original land grant and subsequent deeds. Some garages, backyard gardens, and swimming pools were completely on Hayes land. This explained their new interest in forcing me to join their association or pay their ridiculous fines. Someone had obviously discovered the error and realized they were vulnerable rather than confronting me with integrity. They had decided to try to intimidate me into doing what they wanted. Their mistake had just given me immense authority. I had no desire to force innocent homeowners off their property. These people had purchased their homes in good faith, but the Homeowners Association's new recreation center was something else entirely. Construction had only just begun 3 months earlier. Well after I had acquired ownership of the property, they had not sought permission offered to purchase the property, or even made me aware of their plans. They had simply assumed they could take what they wanted. I could have marched down to their office immediately with my discoveries, but that would have been short-term gratification. Only the need to burst into their tidy community center. With my proof was overwhelming nearly. I remember raised in shock, stuttered apologies for withdrawal, immediate backing down. But I had been advised by my grandfather, wiser than to ever show all your ace up the sleeve. Right from the start, he'd warned me hundreds of times. Document plan and go slow instead of leaping to do something on the spur of the moment. I had called up Mason Bradley, a land surveyor, whose relatives had worked with mine for 3 generations. When I explained the situation, he agreed to hurry up the work. "Your grandfather was a good man," he said. "I'd be happy to help set this right." Then I called Patricia Morrison, one of the most respected real estate lawyers in the state. Her law firm had a reputation for taking on big interests and prevailing exactly what I needed when I explained my case over the phone. Patricia's assistant arranged an appointment for the very next morning. Her office occupied the whole top floor of a downtown skyscraper, with views over the river and the farmland beyond the waiting area, boasted framed newspaper clippings of her victories against developers, utility companies, and yes, overzealous homeowners associations. Patricia herself was a tough woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair styled in a precise bob and piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess everything they took in. She was wearing a tailored charcoal suit and modest jewelry, a working professional woman who didn't let her reputation outrun her, but paraded success. She listened intently as I described the situation every so often and made notes on a yellow legal pad. "Show me what you found," she said. After I completed, I spread copies of the county records maps of property and photographs of the construction site out on her massive desk for nearly an hour. She read through every document methodically, every now and then, querying to clarify concerning the past of the property or the timeline of the homeowners association's correspondence. After reading my documents, she leaned back in her chair and smiled for the first time since I had arrived in her office. The difference was breathtaking. Her stern look relaxed into something nearly predatory. "They've really overplayed their hand this time," she said, tapping my grandfather's original deed with an immaculately manicured fingernail. "Not only do we have them dead to rights on the trespassing and illegal development, but their intimidating letters are harassment and even possibly extortion, the fact that they're building permanent structures on your land right now and simultaneously trying to extort money from you. That's going to not be very pretty in court altogether." We came up with a game plan. The surveyor completed his task within a week, confirming everything that I had discovered in the county records. Patricia filed initial pleadings with the court to file our case, but advised that we present the homeowners association a chance to settle the matter before going after a formal lawsuit. As fate would have it, their weekly board meeting was scheduled for the following evening, and it was open to the public. I decided to attend as an unwanted visitor. Patricia advised me to remain calm and factual, no matter how tempting it might be to vent my anger. "Let them dig their own grave," she counseled old people like this. "Have a tendency to reveal their true character." When was confronted with the fact that the meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a self-congratulatory building modeled after a colonial mansion with white columns and a portico more suitable to Virginia than to our rural Midwestern county. The parking lot boasted luxury vehicles, Mercedes, BMWs, even a couple of Teslas. A far cry from my grandfather's old pickup truck that I still drove as I parked between a shiny Audi and a spotless Land Rover. I couldn't help but wonder how different we saw the land beneath our feet. To me, it was heritage and history. To them, it was real estate. The clubhouse interior was equally tacky with chandeliers, crown molding, and oil paintings of idyllic scenes, which bore little resemblance to the actual landscape they had leveled to create their community. Ironically, one painting depicted a historic farmhouse much like my own, with fields of gold surrounding it. The very type of environment which they were currently trying to drive out of business around 40. Individuals were already seated in neat rows of chairs. When I walked in, most of them looked bored or looking at their phones. Some were actively engaged, discussing property values and home repair projects. I saw a refrigerator of refreshments in the corner, expensive-looking pastries, and a coffee barrister with china cups and not paper. The homeowners association clearly paid substantial dues to fund such amenities. At the front of the room, 5 board members sat behind a long table looking serious in their business attire. Even though the proceedings were dull, their nameplates were prominently displayed, and a recording secretary sat off to one side with a laptop. All was choreographed to convey authority and legitimacy. I knew the president, Richard Harrington, from his signature. On the threatening letters, he was a retired executive in his 70s, with an authoritative tone, silver hair and a costly haircut, and a custom navy suit that likely cost more than a month's worth of my farm's electricity bills. His voice had the practice rhythm of someone used to being obeyed, without question. Beside him sat a younger man introduced as the vice president, who nodded vigorously at everything Harrington said, and 3 other members, 2 women and another man, who appeared to serve mainly as an audience for Harrington's declarations. I sat in the back row and waited patiently for discussions of landscape maintenance contracts, a plan for additional street lighting, and a heated debate over permitted Halloween decorations. It seemed inflatable, decorations were considered tacky, and a resident had stirred up a considerable controversy by installing a 15-foot ghost on their front lawn. Last year, the issue was brought to a vote, and inflatable decorations were formally banned, with Harrington invoking his power to override a tie between the rest of the board members. At last, they opened the floor to new business. I raised my hand and was recognized with clear reluctance by Harrington, who clearly didn't know me. "My name is Alexander Hayes," I said, standing up. "I own Hayes Family Farm, which borders your community to the west." A murmur went through the room as people turned to look at me. Harrington's face changed from mild annoyance to wary hostility. "Mr. Hayes, that is residents of Oak Ridge Estates," he responded brusquely. "If you're experiencing difficulties with the neighboring properties, you may call the county. I'm here because I've had several letters from your association requesting payment of $300,000 and threat of suit." I responded, maintaining my composure. Some residents were perplexed, while others seemed embarrassed. Harrington's face wrined slightly. "That matter pertains to non-compliance with community standards on property, which is within our jurisdiction." He stated firmly, "This isn't the venue in which that discussion." I smiled and produced a folder from my briefcase. "Actually, I think your residents would be very interested in this discussion, considering their homeowners association has illegally constructed a recreation center on my land without permission, compensation, or even notification." The room fell silent. In addition, I continued as according to county records and a survey I had taken last week, approximately 45 houses in this community are partially situated on land that legally belongs to my family. And for over a century, the color drained from Harrington's face. As I approached the table and laid the survey maps on the board members' table, the other residents began to whisper to one another, some standing to see better at the documents. "This is preposterous," Harrington stammered. But I could notice the fear in his eyes as he gazed at the irrefutable evidence before him. One of the other board members, a woman who had already introduced herself as a real estate agent, studied the maps with growing alarm. "Richard," she said quietly, "these appear to be genuine. My attorney has prepared documents for a lawsuit demanding immediate stop to construction removal of all illegally erected structures on my property, compensation for land use since the first development, and damages for harassment." I explained, still maintaining my cool, though my heart was racing. "However, I'm willing to compromise a settlement." Before submitting, the residents were now openly, some angrily firing questions at the board. Harrington attempted reasserting control of the meeting, banging his gavel and demanding order. But it was too late. The painstakingly constructed facade of authority had crumbled, revealing the truth. They had known of this problem and had attempted to bully me rather than meet it fairly. A week later, I sat opposite the Homeowners Association board members and their nervously grasped lawyer in Patricia's office. Absent was their arrogance replaced by a grim acceptance of their weak position. Their lawyer had clearly made the gravity of their situation known to them. They had not only invaded my property without asking, but had attempted to extort money from me. Under false pretenses, the potential damages would bankrupt the association and endanger all homeowners. Furthermore, the negative publicity would destroy property values throughout the community. The settlement terms were straightforward. The Homeowners Association would instantly drop all financial claims against me and my property. They would compensate the land on which they had constructed at double the market price. They would pay for all my legal fees, and they would release a public apology to me and the members of the community whom they had deceived further. They would build a clear demarcation between my farm and their development with adequate signage and proper legal documents in order to prevent disturbance to the homeowners, whose homes partly encroached on my land. I sold those specific areas at fair market value, with the Homeowners Association paying the fees. When Patricia spoke the total settlement figure just over $2 million. Harrington looked physically sick. Their lawyer, however, easily accepted the terms, knowing the alternative would be much worse. The papers were signed that afternoon as we left the meeting. Patricia shook my hand with a happy smile. "They're getting off easy," she said. "A jury would have given you much more." I thought that would be it. But 1 month later, I received a surprising phone call. A commercial developer had learned about the situation and wanted to purchase the tract of land where the Homeowners Association had attempted to construct their recreation center. They were considering constructing a small shopping center with a grocery store, restaurants, and retail space to serve the booming suburban community. Their proposal was significantly higher than what the Homeowners Association had paid me. In the settlement, I was tempted to refuse on principle. I had never planned to sell any of my family land. But then I remembered Harrington's smug smile when he had dismissed me at that meeting, the threatening letters, and the try to push me off land that had been in my family for generations. The next day, I signed the sale agreement with the commercial developer in Patricia's office. The representative from Meridian Development Group was professional and straightforward articulation of their vision for what they called Haze. Crossing a nod to my family's long history with the property, the plans displayed a refined but earnest commercial center with a grocery store pharmacy, some restaurants, and a little retail space. Large windows would look over the farmland to the west, offering diners at the proposed cafe. A view of the fields and sunset under different circumstances. I might have appreciated their thoughtful design. What I couldn't overlook, however, was the location of the service areas. The dumpsters and staff parking lots, which would all be located on the eastern boundary, right adjacent to the Oakage Estates properties. The developer told me this was merely the most logical configuration in terms of access roads and utilities. But the pleasure I derived was beyond denial. The formerly private backyards of those massive houses would now gaze down upon delivery trucks and resound with the early morning rumble of commercial traffic. We'll begin construction in 60 days, the developer described as, "We signed the final documents." The market study shows high demand for these services in this neighborhood. Of course there was demand. The closest shopping center was now 20 minutes away. The homeowners of Oakage Estates would most likely become regular customers of the very development that would disrupt their peaceful community. The irony was complete. As I handed over the signed documents, I couldn't help but ask, "Did you approach the Homeowners Association about the project before reaching out to me?" The developer's representative smiled knowingly. "We conducted some 8 months ago." Mr. Harrington was quite firm in his denial. He said they would oppose any commercial development near their neighborhood and instructed us to seek elsewhere. When we heard of your court victory, we recognized an opportunity. The planned shopping center would deliver traffic noise and commercial activity directly adjacent, next to the once quiet Oakage Estates neighborhood construction, would open at 7 in the morning, 6 days a week. When it was finished, the businesses would be open from early morning until late evening. The beautiful view which had been used in the Oakage Estates brochures would be lost to the back of a strip mall property. Values would necessarily be affected, not ruined, but surely reduced from the high rates they then commanded. The irony was not lost on me in their greedy attempt to intrude onto my property. The Homeowners Association had unintentionally triggered a sequence of events that would irrevocably change their gated community. Had they come to me in good faith? Right from the beginning, had they agreed to buy the land in good conscience, or even recognized their mistake? I would have been willing to leave the agricultural buffer between our properties alone. Their pride and deceit had led directly to this outcome, as I watched while the surveyors drew the boundaries for the new development the following week, measuring and stamping where the foundation would soon be laid. I couldn't help but remember my grandfather and what he would have said about this development. I could almost hear his voice worn by years working under the open sky. The land remembers how you treat it, and so do the people who love it. He had always believed that respecting your neighbors and being honest were the pillars of a community. The Homeowners Association had failed to see that plain truth, and now they were enjoying the fruits of their labor. As I turned to go back to the farmhouse, which had been my family's residence for generations, I spotted Richard Harrington standing on the edge of his land, watching the surveyors with a serious face. Our eyes met for an instant across the distance. He looked away first,